Bad things will be gone, the good remains. I will walk.
Hey, good morning, everybody. We are here with Andrew Medford from Growing for Market Magazine, One Drop Farm, and Industry Extraordinaire. So Andrew's been a friend of mine for, I'm going to think, 4 years now, where he first helped me get my tomato operation up and off the ground in a matter of an hour. So, and there's much more I could have learned, but he helped me with my immediate problems. We met face to face for the first time at Johnny's. We've co-presented a bunch of times, and it's been a great friendship. So thank you for taking time out and giving to State of the Soil Season 2, a return speaker. And may have you introduce yourself a little bit and give us some background for the 2 or 3 people that may not know who you are.
Of course, Nick. Well, thanks so much for having me back. I just appreciate the opportunity to be on State of the Soil yet again, as you pointed out. So, I'm Andrew Medford. I'm the editor of Growing for Market Magazine. I have a farm here in central Maine where we're coming to you live from today, although live recorded. All right, you can edit that part out, right? Maybe I should start over.
No, I'm going to leave it in because then I can put pictures of when I was there and show everybody how ridiculously beautiful and picturesque it is.
Yeah, okay. All right, so all right, start.
Yeah, I net all this out. You can just start over.
Okay. In addition to the magazine, we have a farm here in central Maine, and so my background is that I apprenticed around the country for a number of years. I worked on farms in six different states, and we ended up here in Maine, and it just serendipitously happened to be about a half an hour away from the Johnny's research farm. And so at the same time that we were trying to get our farm going here in Maine, I started working for Johnny's in the research department, and I became more and more focused on greenhouse hoop house production. I was always a tomato nerd, cucumber nerd, but over the time that I worked there, I got more and more focused on greenhouse hoop house, and then I think our customer base also got more focused on greenhouse and hoop house, partially because I think that in many places the demand for local food outstrips the supply, and so of course one way you can increase the supply is just by producing more in season. The other way you can increase the supply of local food is by stretching out that season, which is why I think that the season extension has been so important in the local food movement lately. Is because almost everywhere you live is limited by season, right? And so that's why you see people in Florida, California, these places that you don't think of as being very limited on season, putting up greenhouses and hoop houses. So by the time I left Johnny's at the end of 2015, I was almost exclusively focused on greenhouse stuff, which was my real passion, which led me to write the book called The Greenhouse and Hoop House Growers Handbook, which is 1 year old now. It came out February 2017.
If you've never seen it, so get it. I think it was very highly received. I mean, everybody that got it, it's a powerhouse of information. And we had talked as you were kind of finishing up writing it, and I know the dedication. Well, I would like to think I knew the dedication that you put into it is tremendous, and it's an excellent resource.
Thank you, Nick. Yeah, if I can, talk about the book a little bit, then
please.
I thought that reason that I wanted to write it is because one of the things, as you know, Nick, one of the things that I did at Johnny's was to troubleshoot growers' questions. In fact, that's kind of what Nick alluded to a minute ago. Is that the way that we met was when I was some questions came in from Nick through the commercial sales department, and so we ended up getting hooked up, which I'm so glad that we did, and that we worked out some problems, I think, and But one thing that I saw is that growers like yourself included, Nick, just I heard the same questions over and over again. And so it made me think that either the information isn't out there or it's not disseminated. It's not well transferred to the people who need it. And so I actually had the thought several times before writing the book. I thought, God, someone should write about a book about this stuff, until finally I just did start putting pen to paper. And so So that's where the book came from. And really, really the idea behind it was that in my years of apprenticing, most of the smaller growers that I was working for, they were growing in greenhouses and hoop houses just the same way that they were growing out in the field. Okay, same spacing, same varieties. You know, they were just bringing their field practices indoors. And what happened when I was at Johnny's is I got access to much more professional growers, larger growers. You know, one of the things I talk about in the book is the Dutch growing system, because they've always been very horticultural, and because they're so far north on the globe, they're very reliant on greenhouses. So I got introduced through Johnny's to a much more professional way to grow, really. And then the question became, well, how much of that can transfer to my own on my own production? Because a lot of the bigger growers that I visited, they had glass houses, they had really nice heating systems, top of the line climate control systems and things like that. And so what I didn't know was how much of their success was based on essentially having a fancier greenhouse than I did. And so I tried all this stuff out on my own farm, and I found that most of it worked really well and transferred to a lower tech setting. And so that's really what the book is. If I had to make a short title for the book, it would be what works for big greenhouse growers that you can also use.
That's a great way to say it, because that's some of the things that we're going to dive into today. And if I had to give my take on the book, not only is there all this practical growing stuff, but you also show people what it takes to be a market gardener. You go over some of the cost savings, and then why you should invest in certain things over the others to save money in the long run. You cover a lot more in the book than what the title alludes to. And I think those years of internships and the years of having your own farm, and of course all the things that you're exposed to at Johnny's, I mean, certainly added to that book. And I think that's what makes this particular book so special. So again, it's a powerhouse. I can't get into how much extra information is in there, and it's oftentimes just a sentence or two that you've sprinkled in between the lines, but there's a lot of very practical information for not just growing in the growing in the greenhouse, but for running a farm business at the same time.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that you found it useful, because that's exactly what I wanted it to be. I want it to be nothing if not practical, because I know that's what people need. Is they just need to know how the rubber can hit the road, and how they can have practical suggestions. And I wanted to talk a little about the theory behind greenhouse growing, but the main thing is I just wanted to cut to the chase and tell people how to do things more efficient and more effectively in their greenhouses or hoop houses. So sort of like the magazine, Growing for Market, which that is what I left Johnny's to do, is to take over Growing for Market, which is now we're in our 27th year. I feel like the strength of Growing for Market is the same thing as being practical. You know, we don't have a lot of lifestyle pieces and fluff. You know, we try to just 10 times a year send information that growers can really use. And so that's what I've been spending a lot of my time doing is the magazine these days.
Well, one of the things that we talk a lot about this year is the notion of a legacy. And Lynn certainly built a legacy whenever she started and founded the magazine and ran it up through, thank God you took over. But it's something that's so valuable to so many of us, and to see that continue in such a profound way, it was very nice to see. And I think it's under very capable hands, and I appreciate you stepping up and continuing on what we all need to have.
Well, thanks, Nick. You know, that's, if I can say just a bit about that, I've been getting Growing for Market probably for a decade before taking it over. And so the way that all came about is that I had been writing for Growing for Market on a fairly regular basis in the years leading up to my taking it over. And so the founder, Lynn Basinski, who also wrote The Flower Farmer, a book about the book about flower farming, if you are familiar with that. She had a market farm out in Kansas, and around the time that she started the magazine in 1992, she and her husband were looking around for these things. And so there wasn't State of the Soil. There wasn't the internet at that time that was as reliable of a resource. And so they were in the position of many small farmers, is trying to figure out all kinds of things, from what varieties to use to what spacings to plant at, and all kinds of things. And the information didn't really exist. And so they'd go off and do these research projects. And so they just figured, well, we should write them up. And that's how Growing for Market started 27 years ago. And so Lynn told me that with a very small publication like we have, right, we're not affiliated with any larger publications or anything. So we're small, independent, kind of like many of our readers' farms. So she told me that she thought that it was important for such a small publication as we have, for the editor to be also writing for the magazine from time to time, which I confess I've not been doing very much of, because I've been so busy getting up to speed on the magazine itself and editing my book. But she wanted whoever took the magazine over to also be writing for it. And so she told me that I was a logical choice in that regard, because I was already writing for the magazine. And so, yeah, I thought the magazine is a real important resource for growers. I loved it. And so I wanted somebody to take care of it. And I figured, well, it might as well be me. And so now we've moved it to my farm. I rented a box truck at one point, drove it out to Kansas, and put the whole magazine in the back of the truck. And now I run the magazine from my farm here in Maine. So that's how that all came about.
Well, I'd like to point out a couple of things. We're big on action taking in this community. You took action to write the book because you found a need. You took action to take over this legacy magazine. I mean, this, for people in our industry, this, I don't think you can really quantify the value of how much that magazine helps so many people. So you took that over. It takes people doing big things like that to propel us all forward. So hats off to you and your whole team of your family for helping us all continue to get that information. Little side note, you invited me out for the maple syrup thing. I can't take you up on it this year, but next year I'm going to figure out a way. I think that's going to be like the most fascinating thing ever. And the ability to come back to your place, I'm very much looking forward to it. So not this year, but 2019, I'm going to be all up in there doing whatever you need me to do. I'm very excited about it. So
great. Come see us. It'll be fun.
Yeah. And I also want to hit, Andrew casually mentioned that he was 30 minutes away from Johnny's. It's the most picturesque drive. Like, I could have spent all day making this 30-minute drive. It's along this river. I mean, it's just, northern Maine is beautiful. So yeah, I don't know. I need to get back because I miss it.
Yeah, I hope you will, Nick. I imagine that that Maine on Valentine's Day looks a little different than Texas does on Valentine's Day. We probably got about 10 feet more snow than you do.
Yeah, imagine just a gray slate of brown and nothing. And sometimes the sun's out and then it gets colder. I don't know what's going on there.
Yeah. Well, and I say Valentine's Day because, at least in our area, Valentine's Day is a time when the sap will start running many years, which means we're having days that are above freezing, because for the sap to run, you need days to be above freezing and the nights to be below. And so that's around the time of the year that we start getting back into non-freezing daytime temperatures.
Awesome. Well, this year, put my name on a bottle, would you?
Yeah, we'll do.
Let me see. Let's kind of get into the book. Let's start talking about the resources. Why you're here. One of the things I thought was very interesting, and there's a lot of debate whenever somebody first starts, what do I get? What do I do? And then you cover choosing a structure based on crop. And I think there's a lot of upfront research that needs to be done. What crop should I grow? Why should I grow it? Where are we going to sell it? And that kind of thing. But talk a little bit about structures, if you will, and why you would choose one structure for one crop over another.
Yeah, good question, Nick. The biggest distinction that I would make when choosing structures is to think about whether you're primarily growing a shorter crop like greens, or a taller crop like any of the vining fruiting crops, tomatoes, cucumbers, and the like. Because if you are growing a shorter crop like any of the greens crops, you can put a little bit less money in the structure and build a shorter structure. Whereas if you are growing any of those vining fruiting crops, the extra height is going to be something you can take advantage of. Okay, you can make advantage of that vertical space by trellising your crops up, and they will actually be better ventilated too if it's a taller structure, because there will be more headspace for the hot air to build up in the top of a greenhouse or hoop house. One of the most basic things is that if you are doing the vining crops, or even if you're doing a mixed cropping system like so many do, as far as growing the vining crops in the summertime and the leafy crops in the wintertime, pay a little extra. For example, our hoop houses, we built them ourselves as a kit, and we were able to pay a little bit extra to get taller ground posts. I think our ground posts were 2 extra feet, and that really pays off, because that means that the trusses in our hoop houses are 9 feet off the ground. And so that's about as tall as our tomatoes will grow in a short season here in Maine. And so what I've gotten into doing is letting them grow up to about 9 feet. And then I will top them at the end of August, because if you think about it, particularly the large fruited tomatoes, it takes about 60 days for a blossom on your tomato plant to turn into a ripe, large fruited beefsteak tomato. So the way you think of it is that any flowers that are set in the last 2 months of your season, you're not going to pick as ripe fruit. So I know in our area that even if they haven't been killed by frost, which is good likelihood by the beginning of October, our light and heat are just gone, so that tomatoes are not going to make any more fruit past about the beginning of October, right? So I count back 2 months from the beginning of October, beginning of September to beginning of August. So I top the plants, as far as I cut the head off of the plants, and then and take off any suckers. And so and that the head of the plant is about 9 feet off the ground in most years. And so I just grow them up, top them, take the suckers off, and that's a perfect height for me. But even if you have a longer season, you can, it just gives you more vertical space to grow that crop in. So those would be the big things. And the other thing is if you are shopping for a new structure, is to pay attention to the gauge of the steel. A lot of times, there are a lot of different hoop house suppliers out there. There are a lot that make really good hoop houses. I'm not going to endorse one over the other. Also, because it's very important that you buy regionally, because they're very heavy structures. Shipping can be really expensive. If there's a lot of freight. If you lived on the West Coast and you picked an East Coast supplier, I think you probably pay more in shipping than the structure itself to get the structure out to you. So I would advise people to see what suppliers are regional. Talk to your neighbors, find out who made their structure and if they're happy with it or not. And then a way to compare apples to apples is if let's say you're looking at two different 30 by 100 hoop houses, and one is a lot cheaper than the other, probably the reason that the one is cheaper is probably because it's lighter gauge steel. So that's one of the basic things that you can, if you don't know, find out what gauge steel the structure that you're thinking about buying is. And another thing is that it's better to have a hoop house that's drilled through as few times as possible, because anywhere where they're drilling a hole or putting a screw through the wall of your hoop house tubes is going to create a weak point. And so the quickest and easiest way to connect two pipes is to drill a hole. Okay, that's the easiest way to do things. And there are things called cross connects, which are specialized pieces of aluminum that will bolt together two pieces of steel at a steel tubing at a 90-degree angle. And so that's another thing to be able to compare apples to apples. Is if you can find structures that use cross connects wherever possible. Now, every structure is going to have some screws in the frame somewhere, but if you look at the kit, like if you can get a packing list essentially and see what comes with the kit. If you see a lot of cross connectors coming, that's a good sign. If you don't see any cross connectors and it's all screws, it's not necessarily not to buy it, but it's not going to be as strong as a structure which matters a lot for us up here in Maine, right? Because you've seen those pictures that I put, Nick, where sometimes we have tons of snow. Sometimes we'll get a lot of snow. It's really important. We're also very windy here. So I build a structure with strength in mind. Maybe if you don't have any snow load and you're not in a very windy area, maybe that is not as much of a factor for you. But you know,
Well,
those are ways
even in Texas, I mean, as most people know, one of our hoop houses got picked up and thrown across the street when a tornado hit it. I mean, and then significantly damaged the other one. I mean, we've got severe winds. We're really bad with thick ice storms, like 2 to 3 inches of ice coming through for a couple of weeks. Yeah, it sucks. Last time that happened, we were without power for 14 days. I mean, it's not a lot of fun. So everybody has some type of regional concern to look at. And I think to your point, finding a regional supplier with people and sales staff that knows how to address these things would be pretty critical.
Yeah, we all have weather. You know, you can think of it that way. Is it even if you don't need to worry about getting a foot of snow on your house like I do, it's going to last longer if you just build it stronger in the first place.
Sure. That leads us right into you have a part in your book where it's talking about saving money versus making money, and I know myself, like we built our high tunnel, and I probably spent an extra $2,000 or $3,000 to make enhancements. Like we insect screened both of the end walls all the way up and the side walls. So whenever we roll these things up, we have grasshoppers really bad here. So for me, the ability to screen the whole thing and spend a little bit extra money meant that I would not have to deal with as many grasshoppers. They always get in somehow because, you know, they're hard to seal up 100%, but it significantly keeps it down while I maintain the airflow definitely gets cut down, but we're so windy. I'm almost thankful for that because it's not beating up the plants. But, you know, 14 foot by 30 foot of airflow is still a pretty decent amount, especially when it's on all 4 sides. So what are some things we can do maybe in the build out phase or supplying it where let's go ahead and spend a little bit extra not to have to rebuy something later on in the future or that's going to make a significant difference in the growth of the plant?
Yeah, good question. So as far as upfront investments you can make that will make things grow a little better, yeah, insect netting is a good one. You know, grasshoppers aren't a problem for us, but we had really bad cucumber beetles that were both doing a lot of chewing damage. And then if you're familiar, cucumber beetles are a big vector for bacterial wilt, which is the thing. If you've ever had a cucumber or a squash plant that's looking beautiful one day and you come back the next day and it's just a wilted mess, that's bacterial wilt. It's just a catastrophic plant death. And so that's hard to deal with. And plus, since we're certified organic, we didn't have very many sprays that were effective against those cucumber beetles. And so we netted off our house too. We noticed the reduction in airflow. At least with cucumbers, greenhouse cucumbers, you shouldn't have the pollination problems that you might encounter with let's say tomatoes getting too hot. And so I feel like cucumbers you can grow hotter, enough water to them. So that's what we did. We just put extra water on our cukes and they were good. You know, as far as making an upfront investment, Nick, I would say do what you got to do to get as good ventilation as possible. You really can't ever have too much ventilation. So by that, I mean putting louvered vents in the end walls of your houses. If you're in a warmer climate that like you are, Nick, maybe even putting exhaust fans to actively circulate the air through the house. Putting horizontal airflow fans inside of the structure. And one other feature that I'm not sure if a lot of people are aware of is that a lot of manufacturers make a greenhouse or hoop house that has a ridge vent. So it has essentially a little tiny roll up side that runs the entire length of the greenhouse up at the ridge, right where hot air otherwise builds up. So it creates an outlet for hot air right where it wants to go anyway. And if you can afford a ridge vent, it is well worth the money. It adds upfront cost, of course, like anything adding infrastructure to a greenhouse or hoop house. But the climate is so much drier and so much cooler with just having a big inlet in the top of the house. You know, those are the things that come to mind as far as really worthwhile investments in infrastructure.
So we'll probably recover some of this, but let me ask you this: if I were to take you and your family and transplant you to, it doesn't matter, anywhere in the country, what are some ways that you would approach, Andrew? You have to build a let's start with a hoop house, because I think that's a good gateway drug in all this. So if you were placed in this hypothetical new farm, how would you go about building that greenhouse, or the high tunnel?
You mean planning it out?
Yeah, like I know for sure, no matter where I go in the country, I want to have these three things, or four, however many you can come up with, like must-haves for a high tunnel. And I kind of snuck this one in on you, but I wanted to see what you'd say. I like keeping everybody on their toes.
Pop quiz, yeah. I don't know if roll-up sides are too obvious, but I've known people who have had structures that they didn't have them, and I get it. The original idea behind a hoop house is just to have this super simple structure. Like our hoop houses, for example, we have a little bit of heated greenhouse space, and we have more hoop house space. So, but I would say that our hoop houses, we have made them a little bit more automated by installing the horizontal airflow fans inside. We also have we have vents at the top of the end walls that are attached to a thermostat. So at least when it gets too hot in there, or too cold for that matter, and we're off in the back 40, they just open or close, and we don't have to do anything to them. And it just really helps regulate the temperature, especially on days when the sun's going back and forth behind the clouds. Any amount of automation like that will help a little bit. So I would say getting roll-up sides, horizontal airflow. I don't know, because I feel like one of the things I like about growing is that part of it's a matter of personal style. Some people just want to take it as simple as possible and just have get as close to a sheet of plastic over some crops as possible, and just want to keep it really simple. And then some people do want to get a lot fancier and have a lot of automation, which of course gives you just more control and less stuff that you find yourself having to do on an hour-to-hour basis. But for the most basic stuff, having roll-up sides, or a peak vent, I should say, since we were just talking about the peak vent, having one or the other is just going to be I consider it critical, because it doesn't have to get very hot and sunny before you're overheating in a structure, right? And so having the ability to either roll up the sides, or it's quite likely that if you have a peak vent, you may not need both. In fact, a lot of the bigger greenhouses out there, if you can find some pictures of the biggest greenhouses in the world don't have roll-up sides. What they do is they have peak vents, and it's just so much more efficient letting the heat out the top like that they actually don't even need to roll up the sides. So having something like peak vents or roll-up sides for ventilation. And the other thing that you just have to do is to automate your irrigation, either drip, sprinkler, and then I would say that you should go one further and put that drip or sprinkler system on a timer. You could spend all day long watering in a hoop house. I mean, I think that's anybody who has not installed an irrigation system in a hoop house would know this, because it's so much warmer in there. You really could just waste a lot of time watering. But so I think anyone who's tried that has pretty quickly installed an irrigation system. But I think it's important to automate that, because you can get a really simple $30-$40 irrigation timer. And if you time your irrigations, for one thing, there's no way you can forget and have things die. And also, there's one thing I'm a real big fan of, which is pulse irrigation, which is just a fancy name for splitting up your irrigations into smaller irrigations. So let's say if you knew that your cucumber crop was going to need an hour of water on any given day, you could either break it up into 4 15-minute waterings or 6 10-minute waterings, really whatever you want with an irrigation timer. Those The cheaper timers just offer you fewer watering windows. For example, the $30-$40 timer, it might give you 4 watering windows, and more expensive timers will give you more. And so pulse irrigation has a lot of advantages as far as when it's on the timer, you're not going to forget about it. But also when we get root diseases is when there's standing water around the roots. That's the conditions that most root diseases are overwatering. And that's why even out in the field, a lot of times root diseases will start after a big rainstorm down in a low point of the field. So the nice thing about greenhouse or hoop house is you're not getting any rain, right? So you can control that. You can control the watering. So do it to your own benefit. Okay. So break it up into smaller watering. So you never are in that situation with water standing around the base of your roots. And another little rule of thumb that comes from the greenhouse world is to not start watering until about 2 hours after sunset, and to not start watering until 2 hours after sunrise, and to stop watering at least 2 hours before sunset. Because what happens is when the sun goes down and things cool down, your plant stops transpiring so much. So it's not drawing much water into the system. So you don't want to be watering at night, or else that water is just going to sit there, and either it's going to cause root diseases, it's going to cause splitting in your tomatoes, or another thing is that it could even cause blossom end rot in tomatoes and peppers and susceptible crops like that, because blossom end rot, even though technically it's a deficiency of calcium at the blossom end of your fruit, many times we see blossom end rot occurring in crops where the soil actually tests as having plenty of calcium. It's because one of the things that can cause blossom end rot, even when there's technically enough calcium, is big fluctuations in watering, either too much water or not enough water, and then a big watering after things get really dry. And so keeping soils really more evenly moist is actually going to help with things like blossom end rot. So those are some really pretty cheap and simple infrastructure improvements that can add a lot to a structure.
Whenever when you were trying to help me with, or not trying, you did help me with my tomato issues, that watering, 2 hours after sunrise, 2 hours before sunset fixed, I would say 80% of my problems. Just that one thing, and at the time I couldn't find a source that said that. So it's very valuable information. This wasn't.
Yeah, I'm glad you had that problem, Nick, because that's how we originally met. Is that I was troubleshooting at Johnny's, and so Nick called me up, and I asked him soup to nuts everything about his operation, and things were really pretty good. And he was having all this tomato splitting, and I couldn't figure it out. So, and finally, I thought, what is your watering like?
Constant watering.
And so I was just happy that he was kind of stumping me there for a while. And so I was just happy that I found something I thought was probably a problem. And that's what you did, right? Is you were watering it at night, and you stopped watering at night and turned things around. So
all of a sudden I had perfect sun golds. It was great. I'm going to ask this for a very, very good friend of mine who's just starting to put up her tomatoes. My friend Danya just built her a very nice greenhouse. They're going to do tomatoes. Very concerned about the trellising. And I told her, I said, the first few times that you trellis, you're going to feel like the biggest idiot, because you watch these videos on trellising and people are going wham, 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 and it's done. You eventually get there. Is there any tips you could give for trellising, especially because up here we have to lean in lower a lot? Mm-hmm. We're not topping out. I mean, we have like sometimes 8, sometimes 9 month season up here for tomatoes, so we're leaning and lowering weekly. How do you get in the routine of doing that without just I'll tell you how dumb I was. Is the first time I did it, I unclipped the whole vine, then moved it, and then I mean, I did this for 2 weeks. I was like, there's got to be a better way, and then it was terrible.
Yeah, sounds like it. Yeah, well, that's a good question. My best suggestion is don't watch the videos of people doing it in a commercial greenhouse, or at least don't
Yeah.
That might be worthwhile, but know that you're not going to be going that fast, because that's by people who are doing it all day long, and that may be their main job, and they're so fast you can almost not tell what they're doing because their hands are going so fast. So I guess my first advice is just to take it slow, and realize that, and don't get frustrated with yourself, because you realize on the 100th plant or something it's going to get boring, and you'll just start going faster. And so I guess the other thing would be just to diagram it out, make sure you understand what you're doing, and just don't rush it at first.
And certainly don't unclip.
Yeah, don't unclip the whole vine. If people aren't familiar, the lowering leaning is essentially a technique so you can grow a vine of unlimited length in a limited space, like a greenhouse. Because even these taller structures that they're building these days, because if anybody's been to a commercial tomato greenhouse, they're starting to build them, I don't know, 16, 17 feet tall. And a lot of times they're not growing the vine all the way up there, but you can grow a really long vine in those. But even in really long season production, like you said, Nick, that might be 9, maybe 10, maybe 11 months, you may end up with a tomato vine that's 30, 40 feet long at the end of it. And so the idea is that you have a spool of twine up at the top of the where the trellis connects to the overhead wire, and so that you can actually unspool the twine without disconnecting the whole plant. So you can let the plant down and move it to the position where the next plant was. And so they also call it race tracking, because by the end of the season you have the plants are going around essentially in a big oval. So you have some plants that started out on the left side of the row that have moved around the end over to the right side of the row. It's trying to explain it is probably just a confusing thing. There are pictures in the book, or you can find pictures if you look up lowering and leaning online. But that's the idea.
It's just one of those things that you just have to practice. I've also found that I would say past 60 feet, that the tip of the plant it seems like the nutrients take so long to get to the flower that production really drops off. So we got to taking these things out at about 50 feet in stages. So we would plant 2 rows, wait a couple of weeks, plant another 2 rows, wait a couple of weeks. So there's, at any given time, there could be a couple of rows out of production, but the other ones are kind of supporting it because they're putting out more. And that was just me in my operation of what we did. So yeah. I'm sure the debate is still out on that.
Well, no, that's a good point, Nick. There's only so long that a tomato plant can get. Even though tomatoes are technically perennials, right? If you see a tomato growing down in South America where they're from, it's just going to keep growing until it gets killed by something. It's not subject to the season like the very short season we have up here in Maine. But if you think about the how any plant moves the fluid through its system, it's transpiration, right? The plants don't have a heart pumping the fluid through their system. What they're relying on is transpiration. They're relying on some moisture going out the leaves to draw new moisture in through the roots. And so transpiration can only be so strong. There's some limit to it. And so that's why even in big commercial greenhouses, even in, let's say, a warm part of the world, they're not going to grow a perpetual tomato plant. I mean, in the industry, they usually don't go beyond about a year. Up here in the north, the longest season that people do, which is pretty typical, is to go from the January. So a lot of the growers up here will plant tomatoes out in a heated greenhouse in January, take the crop around to the following December. And that also gives them at least a month where they take all the plant matter out of the greenhouse. They either heat it up or let it freeze. And so there's no pathogens. So the idea is there's no living plant material in there for pathogens to survive on and come over to the other crop. In the deep south, you would have the opposite cycle where you're skipping the hottest part of the year instead of skipping the coldest part of the year, because that's your most adverse season, right? So I know growers in the Deep South would either plant in September or something like that and take the crop around to the following July or August or something like that. Although obviously August in the Deep South is really hot too. Or have two shorter crops. So you could essentially have a fall crop going into the winter, and then have a spring crop to cover as much of your season as you're really going to want to grow in. Because of course, if it's in the hundreds on a daily basis, it's really too hot for anything outside, and going to be even worse for anything inside. So yeah, there's a limit, as you alluded to there, Nick. Don't try to go unlimited on the length of your vines. You'll hit a wall there somewhere.
What's your thoughts on caterpillar design?
I think that caterpillar tunnels, I think they're great, but you get what you pay for. Really, what caterpillars are is a way to get more covered space cheaply, and for that they're great. The square footage cost of putting up a caterpillar tunnel is much lower, of course, than putting up a hoop house or greenhouse. So I would say that if you're just starting out and you want to kind of get into some protected space without either the time commitment or the investment of growing in a greenhouse or hoop house, caterpillar tunnel can be great. Or if you specifically need something that's movable, because of course you can set up caterpillar tunnels in one certain place and then take them down at the end of the year and set them up somewhere else. So if you don't want a permanent structure, that can work really well. But they're also the edges of them are very short, so they can be hard to work in, and the ventilation is just not as good because whether you have roll up sides on caterpillars, although most people I know use the sort of crisscross lace design to build a caterpillar tunnel where you're just pushing up the sides, the ventilation is just not as good because you don't have as many square feet of ventilation going. So caterpillars are great. Caterpillar tunnels are great for what they are. Just don't expect them to be have all the advantages of a full-blown hoop house or greenhouse.
Sure. Obviously, over your career, you've talked to many growers. You've seen a lot of questions come in. What are the top 3 things you wish growers know? I mean, what have you answered? Of course, the book covers a lot of this, but out of all those conversations, what trips up farmers the most? And I'm going to have to limit this to 3 for time's sake. So,
yeah, I think 3 of my biggest things would be to get a soil test, because you wouldn't believe how many times, particularly when I was troubleshooting growers' questions at Johnny's, people would say, "Oh, I'm having this symptom," and a lot of things start with the soil, and a lot of things we can trace back to deficiencies or excesses and things like that, pH imbalance. And so I'd say, well, what's going on in your soil? What's your soil test like? And when you don't have a soil test, it was very hard to diagnose because we don't know. So get a soil test for one thing. If we're staying in the context of greenhouse, hoop house growing, try some greenhouse varieties, because particularly a lot of growers who have made the transition from growing in the field to growing in a greenhouse or hoop house, they may just stick with the same varieties they've got out in the field, and there's a lot of advantages. Particularly the greenhouse and hoop house varieties are bred to have resistance to the diseases that are common and sometimes not found at all out in the field. And so the resistance is just huge, because if your plant dies, so if you built this structure that gives you a longer season and then your plant dies 2/3 of the way through the season, you're not making any money. Think about it. Everybody else gets paid before you do, right? You've paid for the seed, you bought the fertilizer, you bought the structure and everything else. And so all those people have gotten paid. Is really maybe the first half or the first 2/3 of the season that pays everybody else. It's only if you get to the end of the season where you get paid. So use some greenhouse varieties. And I'm not saying go out and if you're growing some field variety in your tunnel, I'm not saying go change the whole thing. I would never tell a grower to change wholesale from one variety over to another variety. What I mean is buy a packet of a corresponding greenhouse variety. You know, if you're growing a field-based beefsteak tomato, try a packet of the greenhouse beefsteak, and just plant a row or a few plants or whatever a meaningful size is to you. Because if all your field tomatoes die from, let's say, leaf mold, like I feel like leaf mold is the poster child for these for greenhouse disease resistances, because it almost never happens out in the field, and after a few years, growers will have a honeymoon with leaf mold because it's a spore-based disease, and so the first couple of years you grow in a greenhouse or hoop house, you may not have any leaf mold, but then once you get it, you're going to have it every single year. And because it's so uncommon in the field, I'm not aware of a field tomato that has leaf mold resistance. And to my mind, that's almost the definition of a greenhouse tomato, is if it has leaf mold, it's probably a greenhouse tomato. So almost all the greenhouse tomatoes have it. So it's something you may not even know. It may be taking your plants down if you don't know what it is. And all you have to do is plant a different variety, and you won't have problems with it. And yeah, the greenhouse seed is a little bit more expensive. You know, I don't work for a seed company anymore. I've got no skin in this game, but in many cases it's worthwhile, because let me put it this way: even if you buy greenhouse seed that's a lot more expensive, dime or 15 cents more expensive than, say, a field variety, you pick one more tomato off of the greenhouse variety, and that's covered your cost and then some, and everything after that's gravy. So you owe it to yourself to at least find out. Do some little trials. Reach out to your commercial sales rep, but ask them what people in your area are growing. Because using greenhouse varieties is one thing I see new people they don't even know what they're missing out on, because they may not have tried them.
Yeah, I'm glad you said reach out to your rep, because when we're going through this, I'm astonished at the people that don't know who their rep are or anything like that. And there's no way for them to reach out to anybody. It's up to the grower to reach out to these reps. Obviously, you and I are a little more connected to Johnny's than anybody else, but the level of people that are there are so giving of their time and of the tremendous resource. So just don't be afraid to reach out to these people. That's what they're there for. So looking for one more thing that you wish everybody would do, and it doesn't necessarily have to be growing.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you would realize that wasn't that wasn't 3.
Sharp now.
The last thing, Nick, that it does relate to growing is to plant more densely. That's when we were talking earlier about how when I went from apprenticing around to having access to more of the big commercial growers, what I noticed was that people, experienced greenhouse growers, plant much more densely than most people do out in the field. It doesn't matter if we're talking fruiting crops like tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, and eggplant, or if we're talking leafy crops like lettuce and greens and things here. But the greenhouse and hoop house that's your precious real estate. You need to make the most of it. And so I wish people would plant more densely. And so for the vining fruiting crops, that means planting double rows instead of single rows. That's one thing. We go a lot into spacing. There's different spacings for each crop, because of course you want to plant each crop as densely as possible without overcrowding it. And so that's why in the book we spend a lot of time talking about what the best spacing is for all these crops. And in the greens crops, that means just tightening up the spacing as much as possible. And in some cases, it may mean just using a more compact variety. If you can grow a head of romaine lettuce that's really fluffy, more like a field variety, it takes up a lot of space. Or what you see in the breeding for greenhouse lettuces, let's say, is packing the same amount of lettuce into a smaller package. And so you'll get let's say you're a romaine grower, you could get just a much denser variety that's been bred for greenhouse, maybe has downy mildew resistance or some other good greenhouse resistances, so that it'll tolerate being packed in there. But that's what the thing that you see on the breeding for the greenhouse greens variety is, trying to just pack the same amount of plant matter into a smaller frame. And so maybe instead of giving every planting lettuce on a 10-inch spacing, you can tighten it down to an 8-inch, or you can grow mini heads of lettuce that are on 6-inch spacing, because spacing is one of those things. It has a geometric impact, right? If you if you can plant a whole bed at 8 inches instead of 10 inches, you'll get so many more heads into a bed times, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 10 crops a year, however many crops a year you get. You're just going to harvest so much more if you can space it tightly. That's something I think people need to have a mind to is how tightly can I possibly pack this stuff in there. So we got spacing recommendations in the book, and the other thing is you can also just try and push it. You'll know you've packed it too tight when things don't grow well, and if they start getting disease, you need to you need to space it back out. So you can either take spacing recommendations either from your seed company or from my book or something like that, or you can just monkey around it with yourself. Think, can I plant these plants more tightly than I have, and give it a shot. You're going to get a lot more yield out of really tightly spaced plants.
Yeah. Getting close to the end here, let's hypothetically say Andrew, on his first day of many years and many different places of interning, if you could go back to yourself and just have a 5-minute conversation with younger Andrew, what would you look forward to telling him about the next few years of his life? What would you wish you had paid more attention to? What would you have changed?
That's a great question, Nick, and I'm so glad you asked it. Maybe it's because I'm getting older now, but I've been thinking about this a lot lately because I've had enough time to make a lot of mistakes, and I've really kind of been reflecting lately.
You're still alive.
What?
You're still alive even after all these mistakes.
Yeah, still sitting up and taking nourishment, but there's none of them killed me, but I do think that it would have been so much easier if I could have gone back to my younger self and told myself when I was starting out, really starting our farm, to focus on something profitable. And if you're staying in business, then diversify. Because I've been traveling a lot lately. I was at the end of January, I was out at Echo Farm Conference in California, and then I was at the Nevada Small Farm Conference at the beginning of February, and then I just got back from the PASA conference, which is always great. And one of the exciting things about all these conferences is there's so many new young growers that are so excited about things. And honestly, I see them making a lot of the mistakes that I made myself. And so that's why I wanted to write the book, is to save people making all the mistakes that I made. But one of the biggest overarching mistakes I feel like I made when we were starting out was really to be too diverse. And I see these people, and they want to do greenhouse growing and field growing, and also do eggs and have a llama breeding project on the side, and also do yogurt and value-added foods. And that's great. Diversity is great. And I understand that that there can be a real value in diversity itself for smaller growers, right? You want to have diversity for your CSA box. You want to have a diverse farmer's market stand or farm stand or whatever you have. But it's hard enough to stay in business. And that's why I would say to pick one or two things to really focus on, because I think people get there's so many things that you can do as a grower. People, I see a lot of young growers just getting over diversified, and then they're not really putting their efforts into any one thing, and they're so distracted. They're not putting enough effort into what's paying the bills. And so that's my advice, is to find something that's going to pay the bills, have the business running before you go off and diversify other projects. So in the context of the book, that's why in the book we focus on 8 crops, and we do that to focus you, because nobody told me that those 8 crops are what most greenhouse growers are making their money and staying in business with. It's after going on farm visit after farm visit, I noticed that the growers that were staying in business were growing tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, eggplant, and they were growing lettuce, greens, microgreens, and they were growing herbs and basil. And I'll say, there's one other big thing if we're going to stay in greenhouse. It's flowers that makes a lot of money for greenhouse growers. That's just outside of my experience. But I would say pick those 8 crops or flowers or pick something in the field to focus on, and don't divide your efforts too much, because I know I did that when we were young. We just had so much stuff going on that we were setting ourselves up for burnout, and we were really also just too our energies were just too divided. And so I would say pick a couple enterprises, like the crops that I just mentioned, or whatever is relevant to your enterprise. Pick the things that are probably going to pay the bills, focus on them. And once you're paying the bills, then re-diversify. Don't start off extremely diversified and then cut down when you're struggling, because it'll be a lot easier if you just figure out what's probably going to pay the bills and do that.
I'm glad you said that. I mean, look, we've got 6 or 7 things going on at any one given time, but that did not happen overnight. It took many, many years, almost 2 decades to get to that point. And the growing pains of getting from one income stream to the another is very painful. And sometimes it's very long and it's expensive, and you have to have the very first business kind of support the second as it gets under its feet. You also have to build in your infrastructure, which includes your employees and great staff and the system. So yeah, diversification takes a long time and sometimes a lot of expense to get going. So doing it year 1, 2, even 5 would be very difficult. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
We're going to wrap it up. Last question is a question I'm asking everybody. If you had to speculate and make a prediction of where agriculture is going to be in 5 years, as far as the markets or maybe some new thing coming out that you may be aware of, take a guess. Where do you see us all out in 5 years?
Well, I think ag's going to be more and more inside, and that's one of my passions. But I think it's one of my passions because I see not only the factor that we talked earlier about growers in almost every area of the country are limited by season, but there's this great demand for local food, and so they can stretch out the season. But also the weather is getting more and more unpredictable. I remember visiting with a grower down in Florida who was putting up hoop houses. In fact, he was from a legacy farming family. For generations, they had farms down there in Florida growing tomatoes. And they said for years and years, they knew what their planting time was, they knew what their variety was, and it was pretty predictable. They could get a particular yield that would pay the bills and then leave them some profit at the end of the year. And then they just started having unpredictable weather, particularly with storms at unpredictable times. And so even though I don't think of Florida as a big greenhouse production area, I think of it as field production. He was building greenhouses as an insurance policy, because even though he couldn't build greenhouses as big as their production was, their field production was, he could get 10 or 20, maybe even 20 times the production out of a greenhouse than he did out of the field. And then when it's storming outside and ruining his field crop, at least he's got that crop insurance there of having a greenhouse. So I think a trend that we've already seen is just going to continue as far as agriculture going more and more inside and protected agriculture. Yeah.
Well, Andrew, it's always a pleasure talking to you. I'm honored to be able to call you a friend and to call you up and twist your arm to be on here. I didn't think it took much twisting, but you're a tremendous resource for all of us. The magazine is unbelievable. The book is unbelievable. And I really appreciate all the work you do, not only for yourself, but for everybody. And you lead a great example for all of us. So thank you very much for taking your time and sharing with everybody. And I will catch you soon, I imagine.
Yeah, no, it was fun. It's always a pleasure, Nick. And actually, if I can take a minute and plug the magazine, I just want to say that Growing for Market magazine is a really good resource. I urge everybody, if you're not familiar, to check it out. And if you want to see a sample copy, it's published digitally and also on paper. Just send us an email, and we'd be happy to send you digital or paper, whatever your preference is. In fact, I went ahead and made a promo code for specifically for State of the Soil watchers. So if you're interested, you can use the promo code SOS18 to get 20% off any subscription on the website. So just to sweeten the deal for you a little bit if you haven't seen it before.
Man, thank you.
Yeah. So check it out.
All right, we'll do. We're going to put links to the book, the magazine. That we'll have that 20% code up for sure, and just check them out, guys. It's highly undervalued source of income or source of information here. So again, thank you, and I'm gonna be coming up to Maine next year. So
All right.
I'll figure that out. So have a good
All
day.
right. Thanks, Nick. Thanks for doing this for us, buddy.
Yeah, thank you. We'll see you.
With
Bye.
you.